Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. Today is a bit of a special day for me because it's my 100th video on YouTube. So in order to celebrate, I figured we'd do something a bit different, and instead of building a website, we're actually going to design a website using Figma, and then in the next video, we're going to go about building that exact same website. If you want to check out the website, I have it hosted and linked down in the description below, so you can check out exactly what we're going to be designing and building. Also, if it's your first time to the channel, make sure you subscribe so that you can see more videos of me simplifying the web for you. Let's get started now. Here's a live example of the site that we're going to be designing, and it's hosted at email.webdevsimplified.com if you want to check it out. And the whole purpose of this site is to get people to sign up for an email list, which is going to be people that are interested in my Learn React Today course. That's why, as you can see, this is a fairly simple and straightforward website with not very much on it, because the entire goal is to get people to sign up for the email list. And now, instead of just showing you exactly how to copy this design into Figma and make it that way, that's really boring and not useful, I'm actually going to show you the entire design process I went through in order to design this site and why I chose the specific things I did. This way, after you're done watching this video, you can come out of it and actually learn the design skills that you need in order to build your own websites instead of just being able to copy other people's designs. So let's jump into Figma and get started on this. Here we go. Here's Figma. I'm going to make my page full screen here so it's a little bit easier to see for you. And the very first thing we need to do is we need to make both a desktop and a mobile version of this site. And the easiest way to do that in Figma is just go over to Frame, click on Frame, and we can choose over here, iPhone X for example. Here's our mobile version of the site. Click Frame again. There's a desktop section, and we can just click Desktop, and here we're going to have our desktop version of the site. And now there's a lot of controversy between whether you should start mobile first or whether you should start desktop first. But my best suggestion would be if more people are going to use your site on the desktop, do desktop first. And if more people are going to use mobile, then start with the mobile design. And if you don't really know which one will be more prevalent, just do whichever one's more comfortable for you. For me, starting with the desktop first is more comfortable, so I'm going to actually start with the desktop design first, and then we're going to move on to the mobile design after we finish the desktop design. I just find it easier to take things away than to add things. So let's zoom in here a little bit so we can get our desktop started. And the very first thing that I like to do whenever I'm designing a site is to actually just start with the header of the site, because the header is usually pretty straightforward and easy to get started on. And for this website, we want the header to actually kind of demonstrate why people should sign up for the email list. I want kind of three things in my header. I want to have my brand name, so Web Dev Simplified. That's really important so people know they're on my page. I also want to have a title which entices people to click on the email list and sign up. And then secondarily, I want kind of like a subtitle, which will describe the information a little bit more in depth for the user. So let's get started by doing that. And as you remember in the previous section when I showed the actual website, we had kind of a curved design that kind of curved across our page. And I like doing these curved style designs as opposed to straight lines because they're just more aesthetically pleasing to people and they're more interesting for the eye to look at. So in order to make a curved design, we're going to use what's called the pen tool. This allows us to click around on different points and just kind of make any shape we want. So let's just start down here quite a ways. We'll click here. We're going to want our design to curve up a little bit, so we'll just draw a line straight up. We'll do another one that goes down a little bit, and then another one that kind of goes back up over here. Let's just draw this out, make sure it's plenty large. Go all the way across here. There we go, and down. And there we go. Now we can click on this bend tool, and this is going to allow us to actually bend our lines, because right now they're just straight lines, but if we click on this with the bend tool, you can see we bend this however we want. So for example, we can just do a little bit of a curve that looks like this. We'll bend this one down here as well, so we get a little bit of another curve. And there we go, we can click done. We can come over here where it says fill to give it a background color, and there we go. We actually have a nice little curved design. Let's make sure that this vector here we just drew is dragged inside of our desktop so it cuts off the top portion like that. And there you go, as you can see, we kind of have that curved design for our header already complete. But let's actually remove this stroke. As you can see, there's this nice ugly black outline. We're just going to remove that so we don't have to worry about that. And then the next important thing to think about when you're designing is what is your color palette? For me, I use this light blue color when I design. I'm going to actually come in here, change the fill, which is 00AAFF. This is my brand color right here. But the problem with this brand color is, as you can see, if we grab the T tool, which stands for text, drag it over here, type out a little bit of text. We're going to make this a little bit larger. Let's just bump this up here. And if we change this to white using the fill again, you see that this white text is actually really hard to see on this light blue background. So instead, we're going to select our vector again, which is just our wavy background, and we're going to change this fill here. We're just going to drag it down to the darker section. Essentially what this is doing is it's allowing us to stay within our brand colors because we're not actually changing the color down here. All we're doing is actually dragging the color up and down, so we're just taking it from a really light color and making it a darker color, but it still fits with the same brand colors, which is really important. Now let's close out of that. This blue looks pretty good for me. And now we can finally move on to putting the text inside of our header that we want. So let's click in here. The very first text we want is the brand name. So we can just type in Web Dev Simplified, and there we go, that's our brand name. And we want to change the size. Obviously 96 is pretty large. We'll bump it down to 48. And I'm also going to want to change the font. In my case, my font that I use for my brand is Gotham Rounded, but this is a font that I specifically have on my computer, so you won't have this option in Figma. But you can use any font you want, even the default one is fine. Just make sure you choose a consistent font throughout your site that looks pretty good. Then after that's done, let's just shrink down our text box here so it fills up the amount of space that our text is, kind of drag that into place. And the next thing I want to do is I want to put the logo on the page right next to the brand name. Generally, when you have your brand name and you want to show it really long, it's a really good idea to put the logo next to it as well. That just kind of reinforces the brand of the page. And luckily with Figma, that's really easy to do. We can just drag an image into the Figma. So let me just drag in my logo here. And as you can see, this is very large. So we're just going to shrink this down. And the easiest way to do this is if you just click on the corner and drag, it's going to scale your image not proportionally. But if you hold down Shift, it's going to perfectly scale your image with the exact proportions. So we can just scale that down quite a bit. Drag it into our canvas here, zoom in. And again, as I mentioned, if we don't use Shift, it's going to drag around, not actually scale. But if we hold down Shift, you'll see that it actually scales perfectly for us. Let's drag that into place. We'll just make it a little bit larger. Just like that. That looks pretty good. So there we go. We have our brand name here, Web Dev Simplified, as well as the icon and logo that goes along with that brand name. And the next thing we want to do is center that in our screen here. And the easiest way to do that is to first group these items together. So once we have them kind of spaced out where we want them like this, if we select both of them by holding down Shift and clicking on both of them, you can see they're both selected over here on the left. If we click Control G, that's going to group them together so we can move them around as one single item, which is going to make it so that we can actually center them very easily using the center tool over here. You can see that we can align our elements left, right, horizontal, whatever we want to do. In our case, we just want to align them horizontally in the center. If we click on that, it's going to move our items so that they're perfectly aligned in the very center of the page. Also, I'm just going to move this a little bit closer to the top of the page, and that's going to be the actual brand name of our page completely taken care of. And we can even rename this layer here. We can just call it brand name, for example, so that way we know what this is over on the side. We can also rename this to header background, again, just to make it easier to parse what's going on the sidebar. The next thing we want to do is actually work on adding the title of our header. This is going to be the incentivation, kind of say, this is why you want to sign up. So let's create the text tool here, drag this out, and this is just going to say something along the lines of exclusive course, wow, I cannot type today, course discounts, there we go. And this is just kind of incentivizing people, saying that if you sign up for the email list, you're going to get exclusive course discounts that no one else is going to get. So now let's again change that. We want to make this bold because this is going to be our main emphasis point. We want it to really stand out. And we also want to increase the font size a little bit. Let's do 64, for example. And again, we need to obviously change this to white. Let's make our text box a little bit bigger so it all fits on one line, just like that. And lastly, we're going to do that align horizontal trick to align it horizontally and drag it a little bit away from our title, just like that. Now, as you can see, we have our main header. And the next thing we want to work on is adding in our subheader. So let's again just use our text tool to do that. It's going to be really straightforward. And this is just going to be kind of the smaller text. So we're just going to say, be the first to know when my Learn React Today course drops. And this is just kind of a clarification of why they want to sign up for the email list in a little bit longer form. And the next thing we want to do is obviously make this smaller text because it's quite a bit larger. And we also want to make it a lot lighter. So we're just going to, for example, use book here. So it's just kind of a lighter sized font, not as heavy, not as bold. And lastly, change it to white. And now you'll notice a problem immediately. If we expand this all the way across on our page, obviously this looks really ugly. We don't want this. And of course, it's just not looking very proper. What we want to use is we want to use a grid in order to line up everything on our page so that it's consistently lined up across all of the different sections of our page. And a really easy way to create a grid is to click on your canvas here, your frame of desktop, and we see this option layout grid. If we click plus, come over here and change this to a column-based grid, you can see if I increase the opacity here up to 25% so it's easy to see, you can see we have these nice red columns going down, and this represents our grid. In our case, we're going to use a 6-column grid because everything on our page is going to fit in the 6 columns. So now we can close out of that, and you can see we have these 6 columns. And what I want to do is I want to fit this text inside of these middle 4 columns. So we know we're always going to have one column on the right and one column on the left, which are going to be completely blank. It's just essentially padding for our page. And then in the center 4 is where all of the text in the top portion of our page is going to go, including our header as well as our brand name in case the page got small enough that they would need to wrap onto the next line. Also, I want to make sure that this here is centered, so let's center that. And this Learn React Today, I want to actually italicize this because it's kind of emphasized. So if we just hit Control I after we highlight it, you'll see it'll italicize that for us. Now you can see our header is not quite low enough, so let's select that header background. Just drag it down a little bit, that looks pretty good there. And you'll already notice that these columns are kind of getting in the way, so if you just click on the desktop and click the eyeball, that'll hide them for you, and you can click it again to reveal them however you need to. Now that finishes up all the work that we need to do on our header, and you may notice that our content is maybe not perfectly positioned, perfectly padded around each other. That's okay. This is just a design, and the design doesn't have to be exactly pixel perfect, because when you go to implement it is when I generally like to make the minute changes for the positioning and everything to make sure the padding looks just right, because it's going to look a little bit different on the web as it does in the design. So don't really fuss over the exact pixel perfect padding around the elements, just make sure they're generally in the right place. And now with the heading out of the way, the next thing we're going to move on to is usually what you want the most important part of your page to be. In our example, this is an email sign up page. So I think the next thing that we should have is the actual option for people to sign up for the email list, because we want the first thing they see to be the most important section of the page. Also, since this is the most important section of the page, we want the user's eye to be drawn to it immediately when they get to the page, which is why we want to use a bright colored background to actually draw their eyes to this section of the page, which is where I'm going to use that brighter blue brand color. And again, I'm going to use the pen tool to make it another wavy color because it's going to be in between two wavy sections, which is going to again draw the user's eye to this section. So let's just come down here, start down. We're just going to kind of draw a similar wave to the top one, but not exactly the same. So we'll just say here maybe, and up, and then let's say we go back down. Make sure we draw it up high enough that everything can fit inside of it. There we go, and go to the bend tool again. Just kind of, make the bends however you want. This is entirely artistic feel. It doesn't have to be perfect by any means. Let's just say that looks pretty good to us. Click done. Remove that ugly stroke because we don't want that. And let's make sure we select our brand color, which in my case is 00AAFF. Whoops, FF, just like that. And as you can see, this is the very bright blue color. And now let's drag this vector into our desktop, and you'll notice it's showing up over top of everything. And that's because over on the sidebar, the things at the top show up on top and the things at the bottom show up in the back. So let's drag this vector all the way down to the very bottom because we want it to show up behind here, our section over here. And we can even rename this to email background, just again, so that we actually can kind of decipher what's going on in the sidebar. Let's drag it down a little bit so we have enough room in this middle section here. And again, you can make these waves however you want. This is just, artistic feel, whatever works for you. And now the next thing we need to do is actually put in the email sign-up form. Again, like I said, this is the most important section of the entire page. This is why we use blue to highlight it. So we want to make sure that these inputs are nice and big, beefy, and they really draw the user's attention to them. So an easy way to make an input element is if we come up here, we have this rectangle option we can just click on, and it'll allow us to draw out a rectangle. So let's just draw out a basic rectangle. It doesn't have to be perfect. We'll say that that's about the size of the input that we're going to have. Let's position it somewhat in the center here. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but one thing to note, let's go to our desktop section, enable our grid. We want this to be in that middle fourth section. So let's make sure, go back here. We select our input and we want it to be lined up on the very edge of that grid on the left-hand side. So it's going to fit inside this 4 square section. And over here, we're going to put the button that's going to go next to it. So we'll leave a little bit of space for that. We can now disable that grid because it makes it very hard to design. And let's click on this input. So for most inputs, what we're going to want to do is we're going to have a white background because it's going to really stand out on this light blue. So let's change our fill here to be bright white. And I like to round the edges a little bit, so we can come up here. This says corner radius. If you just click it and drag to the side, you'll see that it'll increase our radius or decrease our radius. And generally just drag it to something that looks about right. Again, it doesn't have to be pixel perfect. We're going to say 15 looks pretty good for this design. Next, I like to add a stroke on this, which is essentially a border, and it's going to allow us here, we're just going to use 2. It's going to allow it to really stand out on the page, which again is really going to emphasize the point that it's the primary action on the page that we want to draw people to. That's one of the most important things about design, is making sure that you draw the user to the most important section of the page as quickly as possible, which in our case is this input element. And then the next thing we want to do is, since this input element looks pretty good, let's actually add a button right next to it. So again, we can do the same rectangle tool, draw out the button over here, make sure it's the exact same size as our input, and again, enable our grid so that we can make sure our button is pushed up right next to the side of the grid that we want it, just like that. And we'll just expand this input here a little bit so there's a perfect amount of space between the two. Next, let's disable that grid. Makes it difficult to work with. Click on the button, and here we're going to use a black button because black really is going to stand out on that light blue background. So we can just draw this, drag it all the way down into the black, and you'll see that it already stands out really prominently against that light blue background. Next thing that we're going to want to do is add a stroke, and if we add a white stroke around here, it's going to make it pop even more. Again, we'll just make it 2 pixels, same as the input box over here, and as you can see already that box is really sticking out on the page, which is really important. Next thing we want to do is we'll just add, again, that same number, 15 for the corner radius here, so that we have a very similar design between our 2 different inputs and our buttons. It's really important when you're designing things to have consistent design between your different elements, so that way your entire page feels like one cohesive element instead of a bunch of different things thrown on it. That's why if you can reuse the same numbers, reuse the same grid as we have here across your entire application, it makes it much more coherent and a much better design. Now, to make it apparent that these are inputs and buttons, let's add a little bit of text inside of them. So instead of a button here, we can just draw out this text element, just like this, and inside of here, we're just going to make it say join now. And of course, that's black text, can't be seen, so let's change it here to a white, just like that. You can see it says join, not quite spelled properly, join now, exclamation point, and we don't want this to be italic, we just want it to be normal, so we're just going to come in here, we're just going to click medium. It looks a little bit bold. Let's actually just use a normal book font and make sure that that's in here completely centered. We're also going to want to decrease that font size a little bit because 48 is kind of large. So let's reduce that down to 36 and make sure that we have everything centered. This align middle is going to align our text in the center, in the middle, and we have it horizontally centered. So that looks pretty good right there. Our button is a little bit dark though. So I'm actually going to click on that button here. And I'm going to change it to be 111 instead, which is just a slightly less black color, a little bit more gray. And now over here, we can just click on our rectangle, click on our join now, again, and we can group them together with Control G, and now we can move them around, as one element, click on it. There we go, and as you can see, we can just move it around as one element instead of moving it around individually, which is really important when we have these grouped elements like this. Next, let's just actually copy this exact text, move it over here. There we go, looks about right. Let's make sure we change our color, and in here, I want to make the color pop a little bit. So I'm going to use that same dark blue color that we used in our top header section. So we can just click on that down here, which is already in our document color section, which is really handy. So now we have our join now. We can just change this to say enter email or something along those lines. That looks good. We just want to drag this out so it lines up pretty well. And as you can see, that's our email section essentially taken care of. And now to kind of prove the point that your eye is really being drawn to this blue section, let's just kind of zoom out the page. And as you can see, when you look at this, the very first thing that your eye gets brought to is this blue ribbon right in the middle. It's the most prominent section on the page. So we want to make sure that the next section that we create is not going to overpower that blue section. We want to make sure it's laid back enough that the blue section still becomes the most prominent section of our entire page. So the user is most likely to come here and see enter email as the very first thing on the page. So the next sections that we want to do is we want to reinforce why the user should be entering their email, because most people don't like to give up their emails. So the next section and the rest of our website is going to be entirely focused around telling the user why it's a good idea for them to actually commit and enter their email into this form, since as I mentioned, that's the primary purpose of this page. And to do that, we need to actually expand our desktop. So let's click on the desktop. We can just drag this down so it's quite a bit bigger so that we don't run out of space to work with. And now we can zoom in here. And to do that, since I usually focus around creating videos, I decided that it would be a good idea to have a video on my page telling people why they should sign up for the email list, as well as a few bulleted different points. So I'm just going to kind of mock this out over here. We're going to have a rectangle, which is going to be our video. And then over in the section here, we're going to have just a few main points. So we're going to have point 1, point 2, and point 3. And then below all of this information, I like to have just kind of bigger emphases. So down here, we're going to have our 3 main points, which are going to be essentially detailed versions of our mini points up here. So this is kind of the layout that I like to use. It's a very common layout when you're trying to emphasize things to people. You kind of have like an image or a video or something kind of eye-catching right here, which is interesting, as well as you'll have your main points kind of summarized and your main points in more detail to give the people that like to read a little bit more information. So to get started, let's work on just this video section first. And you can't actually import a video into Figma, obviously it's just a design tool. So the best thing to do is actually import like a thumbnail to it and then just add a triangle over top of it that shows that it's a video. So let's do that. I'm just going to drag the thumbnail that I'm using for this video over into here. Let's make sure that we scale this down, again using the shift trick. Drag it over. We can delete this rectangle, that's a placeholder. Push this in, and we want to again line this up using our grid. So let's go back to our desktop, go back to our grid, enable it. And the very first thing that we should have done with our grid is we can actually add some margin around the edge. So let's add a 40 pixel margin around the edge. As you can see, this will allow us to line up our video Oops, select our video. It'll allow us to line it up with the very edge of our grid over here. And again, we want our video to be just half the grid. So we'll just shrink that down till it's half the size of the grid, and that looks pretty good. But you'll notice that our sections up here actually need to be readjusted so that they fit up in that new version of the grid. So let's just go up here, readjust these things. There we go. And this, we just want to readjust the email. We want to drag this down out here, group up our email inbox because we never actually did that. And we want to make sure that our enter email shows up on top of the rectangle. There we go. Now we can just drag this in. So now the rest of our site still lines up with that grid, which is perfect. And we can go back and disable that grid. And now we have our video completely done. And just to emphasize the point that it's a video, we can use down here the polygon tool. We can just drag this out. This is just going to be a triangle by default. And we can just kind of scale this. Let's just say -90. This will give us a nice triangle looking thing. And we can just change this to be white. And this just essentially emphasizes this as a video. This triangle is obviously not going to be in the final website. But when you're looking at a design, it's hard to know if this is a video or an image. So having this triangle right in the middle just kind of emphasizes that it's a video. So when we design the website and build it, we know that this should be a video. And the next thing we want to do is our 3 main points. And for me, the 3 main points why someone should sign up for the email list is that they're going to A, get updates from me on the email list. Then the most important thing is that they're going to get discounts on the course, the Learn React Today course. And then lastly, they're just going to get extra content in the emails that other people are not going to get because I'm going to send special content just to the email subscribers. So those are the 3 points we want to emphasize. So to do that, let's just use our text icon here, drag out some text, make sure that we don't want this to be centered anymore, so we can change it to top left. There we go. And we want our first one to just to say email updates. So email updates. And since these are kind of main bolded points, we want to make it a little bit bigger than the book font. So we're just going to choose medium. It looks a little bit bolder. And this black color looks really good because it really contrasts the rest of the page. So let's remove this here, change the scale of this so that it's exactly the same size. And to even further emphasize this, I'm going to use icons along with these different text to actually emphasize a little bit more what the text are doing. So first, let's increase the size of our text here to 48 so it stands out a little bit more. And then let's grab some icons. The first icon we're going to use is for the emails. So let's drag in the email icon, scale it up just a little bit. There we go. A little bit too big. Let's scale it down. That looks pretty good next to the email like that. And then let's drag in our next one here, which is going to be for people getting discounts. So drag in the money icon. Again, scale it up. Whoops. Scale it up just a little bit. There we go. And that looks about the same as the other one. And lastly, this last icon is going to be for people getting extra content. So we're going to scale this up as well. And that looks, whoops, about the same size as the rest of them. And lastly, let's make sure we group these together. So we can select our email updates, our email icon here, click group. And as you can see, we can now move these around as one cohesive element. And we want to make sure that we line this up somewhere in the middle of our grid here. It just needs to be in those 6 sections. So let's turn on our grid. And there we go. It looks like it's about in the middle of our section, which is where we want it to be. So we can turn that grid back off. Now we can just copy this down, drag it down a little bit. We want to take our icon inside of here, our email icon. We want to delete this and we want to actually drag in our money icon. So let's drag that up into that group and we want to move it into position just like that next to where it says email update. And we're going to change this here to say special discounts and just expand this a little bit so that we get the full text in there just like that. That looks perfect. We can delete this box as well. And we can do this one more time. So let's copy this. Whoops. Drag it down just like this, and we can just delete the money icon because we no longer need that, and we can drag in the extra content icon and make sure, whoops, that it's in the correct spot, just like that. And now an easy way to space out these elements from each other is if we select all 3 of these, click Ctrl-G, that's going to put them in a group. And now you can see we get these little spacer icons that are going to allow us just to drag space in between these different elements. So as you can see, we can drag as much or as little space out between these elements as we want. And for example, we kind of want a decent amount of spacing, so that looks pretty good. And then let's just going to line this up centered with our video, just like that. So now we have our video along with our 3 main points right next to it, emphasizing why people should sign up for our email list. And again, if we zoom out, you can see that the video is kind of eye-catching, but it's still, your attention is brought to this email sign-up section because of that nice bright blue color to it. Now let's zoom in. One thing I realized is we actually need to change this text here. This is going to say exclusive content. Just like that. Perfect. Fits perfectly in there. And the last thing we need to do is our 3 text sections at the very bottom. And these are just going to be emphasizing these 3 points. So let's grab our text tool again, drag this out, and in here we'll do email updates as our first one. And we don't want this to be nearly as emphasized as our bullet points up here. So let's select this and make sure that we actually change our font size to be a little bit smaller. We'll do 36 maybe, that looks pretty good. And we're also going to come in here and change our font color. So our font color is going to be, let's just come down here. We'll change it to maybe 333. That gives us a nice little lightish gray color, but it's still pretty dark. Next thing we want to do is we want to actually add the text that's going to go along with this email updates. And instead of making you listen to me type it out, I'm actually just going to copy it over. So let's paste in that text. And it looks like it formatted it for me already, but essentially the format that we're doing for this is we want it to be lighter than our header, but about the same size. So we changed this to be book instead of medium, which is just a lighter font color. And we also changed the color to be 444, which is ever so slightly lighter colored than our dark text up here. Let's remove this rectangle and let's make sure that our text is lined up perfectly. And we want to again align this to the grid. So let's turn the grid on just like this. And as you can see, we want our email updates to be lined up in this first quadrant. We have 3 things, so we're going to line it up. Each one's going to take up 2 grid columns. Do the same thing for our text down here. Line up both sides of the grid, just like this. There we go. Make sure it expands far enough. And we want to make sure that this text is centered because it's the header. We want it to be very prominent. Now if we turn off our grid, just like this, you can see that looks pretty good right there. Next thing we want to move on to is our next section, which is going to look almost identical to this. So let's actually group these together. That way we can copy it, paste it, and drag it over just like this. And if you hold down Shift while dragging, it makes it so that it lines up perfectly in the same direction. So it's actually completely in line with the previous one, as you can see here. So we'll just drag it over a little ways. Whoops, I let go of Shift. Let's make sure I hold down Shift, let go. And again, turn the grid on so we can line it up perfectly inside of our grid container. So let's select that, drag it over, just like that. And there we go, it's perfectly inside our grid. And let's copy that one more time and line it up inside of this grid section over here. And now we can turn that grid back off. There we go. Let's remove these placeholder rectangles for now and actually just change the text in here. So the first thing we want to do is this will just say special discounts. And this one over here is going to be extra content. Whoops, content, just like that. There we go. And again, I'm just going to copy over the text so you don't have to watch me type it out. That's incredibly boring. And the last one. There we go. And this is all of the content on our entire page. Let's shrink down our desktop so it fills the entire page. Move it over so it's lined up. And as you can see, even with our page zoomed out so we can see the entire thing, the most eye-catching part of our entire page is still this enter email section, which is crucially important. We want to make sure this continues to be the most prominent section of our entire page. Now the next thing we need to do is convert this over to mobile, which actually is fairly straightforward. Especially since we're using a grid-based system, we can essentially just collapse our grid. So everything that's side by side will essentially be one thing on top of the other, and that's how we're going to design our entire page as we scale down to mobile. So the very first thing we need to do is actually copy over our header sections. So let's select both of our headers, just like this. We're just going to copy them and drag them over like this into our iPhone section so we can collapse our desktop, drag these into the iPhone section, and you can see it'll cut them off for us. And we just want to scale these down a little bit. We don't need them to be nearly this large. So we'll just do a little bit of scaling. Maybe not quite that much scaling. Let's make it a little bit larger. There we go. And now we have both our header and our center section, which we can include our content inside of. This looks pretty good like that. And the first thing we need to do is just copy over our main header, just like this. We'll bring it in here. And I don't actually want any of the text to be brought in with this brand name. So we'll scroll down here where it says iPhone X, and where we have our text, just delete that. All we want is the icon. And we can just put the icon in here, make sure we click center, and it's going to completely center the icon right there for us. Because with the text Web Dev Simplified, it's just really long for a phone and just doesn't quite wrap as we would like it to. Next thing we want to do is bring over this exclusive course discount section, and we need to just drastically reduce the size that we're going to have the text be. So in order to do that, we just need to click on our text, and we're going to change it to, for example, 24. And there we go. Now we can just shrink our box to fit that text, click center, and you see that that's centered inside of our screen. Let's zoom in so it's easier to see, drag it down a little bit, and we also need to clearly reduce this icon because it's way too large for the actual text that we have on our page. There we go. Next thing we need to do, copy over our subheader. Again, when we're doing these designs, it's just essentially a lot of copying back and forth. And again, we need to reduce the font size of this. So let's change this to be 18. So it's again slightly smaller than our main header, and drastically reduce the size of the box that we're going to be putting this in. Drag it in here in the center. We can increase it just a little bit. And if you hold down Alt, it actually will scale from the center, as you can see. So we're just going to hold down Alt, drag it out to be about the same size as our main header, and make sure it's in the center by clicking the center button. just like that. There we go. That's our main header taken care of, and really that's pretty easy to do. Once you get one design solidified, like our desktop design over here, converting over to the next design is pretty straightforward. So let's now copy over the email section. So we can select our email, we'll just copy and paste that over here. And again, we just need to drastically reduce the size of this. So let's scale this down a little bit, put this in the center here. There we go. We want it to take up essentially the entire size of the screen. We want to reduce our border a little bit because as you can see, it's now completely rounded. So we'll just scale back our border a little bit. And we also want to reduce that thickness because it's just a little bit too thick for how small it is on the screen. There we go. Next, we can change our font. So this is quite a bit smaller. Let's see if 18 looks pretty good. There we go. That looks pretty good. So there's our input. And now let's drag over the button. So select that. Whoops. Make sure we copy it first. Paste it. Drag it over. And again, we need to reduce this in size quite a bit as well. There we go, it looks pretty good. Let's see what we used for our border over here. We used 13, so let's make sure we use 13 here. Just like that. Drag it to be the exact same size. There we go. And of course, reduce that stroke by 1, so we can just put it down to 1. And we'll change the font size here to be the exact same size 18 that we used above. There we go, that looks pretty good. Let's just make sure that these two elements are centered. So we'll select them, click the center button, and there we go, they're centered in our screen. Should be. There we go, that one and that one, perfect. Now that we have that taken care of, we can move on to our next section. And as I mentioned, these things are side by side, so we're just going to move them on top of each other so they can fit on the mobile screen. So we'll copy over the video, scale this down significantly. There we go, make it a little bit bigger because we essentially want it to take up essentially the full size of the screen. Give it a little bit of breathing room. You can zoom in, there we go. And of course we want to make sure we copy over our button, just so we can remember that this is a video when we go to design it later. Now that that's done, we can copy this section over. And again, this is probably incredibly boring, watching me just copy and paste things all over the place, but it's incredibly important when you're designing. First thing we can do, select our text inside of here, and we want to make sure we change the size of all of our text. So we're just going to bump this down to maybe, let's say, 24. And we're going to do this for all of them. So make this one 24. And of course, the very last one is also going to be 24. Now let's make sure we move these into the correct place. Whoops. There we go. Shrink the spacing between them, just like that. Move it over. And of course, our icons are quite large, so we'll just scale these down a little bit. Scale that one down, and scale that one down. There we go. And we'll also move our text closer to our icons because it's really spaced out at the moment. Get the last one over there. There we go. And we can move the entire thing, so it's just down a little bit from our video, and we want it to be centered in our video as well. Make sure we do that. There we go. That looks good. And now we of course need to expand our iPhone section so that we can fit the rest of our text in here. And this is just going to be really easy. We're just going to copy this over, just like we've been doing with everything else. Decrease the scale of everything. So we'll say 24 for this, and we'll say 24 for this. And we just want to make sure it fits inside of our container. So we'll say just like that. That looks pretty good. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect because when we actually develop it, we're of course going to take the precautions we need. So now we can just copy this. It's going to be actually easier, I think, if we just copy this and change the text inside of it. So we can just take special discounts, and we'll just copy over this text. There we go. Make sure we actually change that font size back to 24. There we go. And we'll do the exact same thing again. We'll just copy this one this time, drag it over. We want this to be 24. And lastly, this to be 24. And of course, whoops, we'll shrink down this text box, drag it up, and there we go. That's our mobile and our desktop view completely taken care of. So if we look at our desktop view, again, we're emphasizing this point on our page, and when we look at the mobile, it's going to look probably something like this. And again, once we load onto the page, you see that this blue section here is definitely the focal point for everybody coming to our website. And that's all it takes to design a both mobile and desktop version of a site. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to take a look at building this site in part 2, which will be linked over here when it comes out, so make sure you don't miss that by subscribing to the channel for all my future videos and clicking the notification bell so you definitely don't miss that next video. Thank you very much for watching this video, and have a good day.